live.
Oh, hello. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me. What's up, Chris? How's it going?
I'm good. I'm doing well. How are you, Wythe?
I'm all right. Yeah, it's a stormy day here in New York.
I know. It just started, too, right before we went live here.
Yeah, hopefully folks can still hear us. We don't cut out, all that good stuff.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, if you get a little thunder in the background, it's just
appropriate,
that metal.
Right?
Yeah, it's metal.
Yeah. Well, the game we'll be talking about, seems pretty appropriate. Maybe, Chris, do you want to intro what are we talking about? What are we doing here today? What is this show?
Yeah, sure. So today we are talking about Danse Macabre, which is a game that I am currently working on. It's a work in progress, but it's a dark fantasy, medieval horror, tabletop role-playing game for one player and one GM. Like I said, currently a work in progress, but the playtest version 1.0 was just dropped on itch.io last night.
Congrats on that, by the way.
Thanks.
So yeah, and we are talking about this in the context of a show called Why We Roll, which we're piloting, which is basically a stream and podcast about TTRPG game design. So we can both talk about games we're working on, and then hopefully, ideally, if people like having us talk about this stuff, we'll have on other folks to talk about their games.
Yeah.
So we'll be posting some material about Stillfleet that we taped, and today we're going to talk about Danse Macabre, and we'll return to both those games because those are the games that you and I have respectively, been working on.
Yeah.
But like I said, hopefully we'll bring in just a lot more voices and perspectives on game design as we go. All right. So with that, do you want to give us more of an intro to Danse Macabre, like set the scene, like imagine we're playing the game. What is happening?
Sure. Yeah. The game is set in a fictional version of 14th century France, so late 1300s. In the text, I think I set it around 1390. And for about 30 or so years now, by anybody's best reckoning, death has abandoned the world. And basically what that kind of amounts to in terms of the gameplay and in terms of the setting is that whenever anybody dies, whether it's of illness, age, violence, what have you, they are resurrected within a few hours to a few days, depending on the individual. And every time a person or an animal is resurrected in this way, they're reborn in this way, they come back with a strange physical or psychic mutation, which are referred to as corruptions. So yeah, basically it's blending things like the Einstein intersection or mutant crawl classics or gamma world, that kind of idea of mutation being everywhere and kind of omnipresent and common, but mixing that with a kind of historical fantasy setting that also, it's got some Souls-like elements to it, obviously, and is it's meant to be kind of an intimate conversation between the player and the GM. Again, there's one player, one GM, about death and dying. And ultimately, the player character, they play this role called the Last Supplicant. They've been called upon either by local clergy, by their village, by a vision that they've experienced. It's kind of up to the player to decide the starting point from there. But they've been called upon to break the cycle of death and rebirth and corruption that is plaguing the world at this point. They can do so by finding fun MacGuffin items that are called Memento Mori. The flavor text around that is very loose. It's meant to be up to the player or the GM, which is called the Warden's interpretation. It can be a reliquary, it can be a weapon, it can be a chalice like the Grail, it can be any kind of item that you want, depending on how you're playing the game. But yeah, it kind of harkens back to Arthurian quests, the whole Grail cycle and all of that stuff, while also having this kind of like darker, more modern spin on it. But yeah, it's like I said, 14th century France. The kingdom isn't even a kingdom anymore. It's been shattered into various kind of warring states of petty kings and warlords. There's a lot of religious strife happening at the same time. Historically around that time, the papacy had split from Italy, and there was a pope in Avignon in the south of France. And so they're a faction that still holds a lot of sway in the south, but then more in the north towards the English Channel, towards Burgundy and all of that stuff. There are kind of new cults that are arising. And when I say cult, I mean it in the kind of classical Catholic sense, where these are saints cults that venerate specific saints, but they're kind of morphing into religions all their own over time, and with the kind of dissolution of papal centrality to the faith. In particular, the one that I've kind of fleshed out the most is a cult called the Brotherhood of the Undying Lamb. And they venerate a saint named Thierry, who is, in the fiction, canonically the first person to be recorded as having been resurrected with a corruption. So they preach the holiness of this kind of resurrection and corruption, kind of hearkening it back to like Jesus coming back after 3 days, all that kind of, all that stuff. Anyway, like I said, a lot of religious strife, a lot of political strife, but ultimately the player character and most of the NPCs that they're going to encounter are peasants. They're villeins. They're working class people. With this kind of backdrop of higher political and religious drama that they're set up against.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, there's so many great nods in this game setup that it's one of those things where in retrospect, it's like, why haven't I played this exact version of, the classic fantasy game? And I think it's in part because a lot of game designers, unlike some OG designers really into this stuff, but a lot of people don't know the history and are not, which is not necessarily a problem, if you're not writing games about pretend fantasy, late medieval or early modern Europe. But if you are writing about that time and place, you might look into, everything from what led to, capitalism and colonialism, but also the religious culture, right? And ideas about death and dying in bodies. And so I think that the fact you know a lot about the time period comes out in the text. Even in this playtest form, right? It's really fun to read. It's very well written, and you bring in a lot of the religious terminology. Even though it's very clear this is a MacGuffin event, right? It reminds me, for some reason, I just keep thinking of The Walking Dead, and it's almost I was like, it's a reverse Walking Dead, but it's kind of like everyone's becoming a zombie, and there's just no final death, and so there's a real sense of hell on earth to. Thinking also of a recent cultural artifact in our world, the big podcast by the Chapo guys about the religious wars that will happen 100 years from your game and sort of kick off, hyper kick off aspects of early capitalism haven't happened yet. But there is this sense of the old world is dying, Catholicism is broken apart, the kingdoms are broken apart, that we're sort of the champions of Catholicism. And so you've given a nice, TTRPG spin on it where all right, you're playing a mutant zombie in this setting. And it's a great, mechanicalization of that draws on some of the best stuff from the OSR. So
thanks.
Why France? Why France in 1390? Were you interested in other places and times, or is there something about specific aspects of history that drew you to all right, you are in, the French countryside in 1390. And maybe this just reflecting on some of the games I've created that are very specific to you are in a specific time and place. It's not generic sci-fi or generic fantasy. So I'm curious, how did history inform that, or was there some other reason you wanted to kind of pick that place?
I think, history, both history and mythological cycles have informed that for me. Because again, a lot of this has been informed by Grail cycles, all that kind of stuff. And even though, Arthur and Camelot, all of that are they have their origins in English mythology and arguably in British history. They were made most famous by French troubadours and French authors who used, these tales of romance, of courtly intrigue, all that stuff in order to kind of solidify the political structure of France itself. So there's, when you're thinking about the Grail cycle, when you're thinking about these kind of sets of mythologies, there's already this very deep French leaning to it anyway. And then another reason is, I think a lot of what we would consider like in the Dragon game or a lot of other typical fantasy settings, they do take a lot from French medieval culture specifically. You see English for sure. I think Robin Hood and things like that have had a big influence, but we don't see a lot of I guess what I would consider Western fantasy that concerns itself too much with like Spain or even Sweden or like places like the Netherlands, things like that. You do see a lot of German influence for sure. I think Warhammer Fantasy pulls a lot from that. Morkborg certainly pulls a lot from German and Norwegian or Scandinavian influence, things like that. But those are kind of like these one-off universes. And then honestly, too, a big part of it is just my own interest in that time and place. I think it's interesting. Again, this kind of like question of the centralization of political and religious power versus, I guess, more like people power is something that was really being debated at that time and place. That's when you start to see, especially after the plague, after the pestilence, you start to see these mass peasant uprisings in cities. And you get that in other places in Europe for sure, but like, Paris and Orleans and all these other larger cities like Rouen in France, you have these massive peasant uprisings. And I think that that's a really interesting, again, just an interesting backdrop to have in the game. And in the game itself, I include that in kind of the lore building section, which I want to flesh out a lot more. But basically, Paris and Rouen are ruins at this point because there were these mass uprisings that just went completely unchecked in the fiction of the game. So those are kind of like, you can explore different cities that are now like shells of their former self.
Right.
In the game.
So that's again that sort of the Walking Dead feel, but transposed to Dragon game and taking it more seriously. Some of the things the Dragon game has never been very good at taking seriously, which is, there's complicated alignment systems and religions, but everyone actually seems to coexist kind of
pretty
okay. Whereas
pretty
in
harmoniously, yeah.
Very small differences in interpretation of religious law led to massive decades, centuries long wars, essentially. So and I think you get at that vibe of like anything could set off this sort of hell on earth, but then undercut it with the mechanic that actually you can never totally die. You just become weirder and weirder and weirder. So there's an interesting tension built in that it I mean, other games have played with like immortality in various forms or legacies or whatever, but I think there's something very different about a game where, from the beginning, you just, you can't die per se. You can become strange and monstrous. You can maybe fail at missions, but
yes.
Your character is not threatened by mortality in the way that murder hobos in other OSR, fantasy games are. So I want to ask about that next, but just to underscore something else you said. I mean, I remember as a kid, I was obsessed. I came around with second edition D&D had just come out, and that was my thing when I was like 12. Yeah, and there were all these terms that I memorized, right? Like, I don't know if you remember encountering this because you have it in the game now. It's like the Bardiche or the Bec de Corban or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, there were all these pole arms that are illustrated in those books that are like, you need to know what a 12-foot long thing with an axe and just an axe is. You need to know what a 12-foot long pole with a spike and just a spike. You need to know what it is if it's got like kind of a hammer and then kind of a pickaxe, and they all have different names, and half of them are just straight up untranslated French.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. That at the time I was like, this must be very important, because this book isn't so long, and it's for some reason teaching, it's pulled a whole page aside to be like, bro, you need to know a lot about medieval French warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And flash forward to now, and I've, in some ways it's an arbitrary design choice. It was flavor. But as a kid, I didn't know. I was just like, okay, this must be, kind of relevant. So it's interesting that you said, the genetics of the game, as you say, they're Arthurian, and the Arthurian cycles really do come out of France, not England. So that we think of them as like an English story, but it was French troubadours or whatever in this moment of change, kind of, taking the medieval world and then turning it into a story that was received later. You know what I mean? It was
Right.
like hundreds of years being kind of collapsed into like a bunch of pop songs.
Yeah.
For some reason, we now know a lot about 12-foot long poles with axes on them. And that's one of the things that like survives, right? Lots of other aspects of medieval culture are probably gone, like many, any time and place, it's just,
Absolutely.
I don't know. But we know about those polearms.
Yeah, I can tell you the difference between a halberd, a bardiche, and a Danish axe, and but no, I mean, I definitely had a similar experience, and I do think that that's an influence on why I'm interested in this period and all of that as well, because I remember being completely fascinated by that the first time I picked up a player's handbook. I think the first edition of the Dragon game that I ever picked up was 3rd edition, which I think they got a little bit more like fantastic with some of the weapons. I think that's when they started to introduce like exotic weapons and things like that. So there was less historicity, but at the same time, it was the same vibe where it's like, yeah, there are 3 full pages dedicated just to illustrating these pole arms and different types of swords and all. And I don't know, I think that's fascinating. And there is actual historical distinction between those weapons that people were serious about. I mean, people would train specifically in a halberd and an arming sword versus any version of axe or whatever. So yeah, I like that flavor element a lot. And it's definitely something that I wanted to include in the game.
Yeah, and I think it's like the treating it seriously in the same way. You could say something Merc Borg does successfully is treat the kind of metal grinder aspect more seriously, and it's almost to the point of like a Rococo like joke kind of aesthetic, but it's like leaning in as opposed to leaning away or trying to split the difference and be like, we're also kid friendly though.
Yeah.
It's like, no, fuck that. Like these games are about, escapist kind of cathartic combat, ritualized combat against monsters to, in many cases, feudally attempt to save unthankful peasants or whatever. Your game's doing something different, but it's kind of leaning into something else. It's like, all right, let's lean into the historicism. But with what I mentioned, the next thing I think we should discuss is that mechanic. So if you don't die, do you want to talk about false death? Like what happens when your character doesn't die in this grim scenario? And what is that kind of meant to achieve for you as a game designer? So I'm curious so maybe sort of 2 things. One is, can you tell us like how it works? And the second is, why? Like what led you to that, or how do you think that gives the player a different experience than another sort of similar historical or fantasy game?
Yeah, for sure. Wait, okay. So what led me to it? What did lead me to it? I think a part of it is in game design, I think we've talked a little bit before, but like I love high lethality games. That's something that I really love about the OSR and about BX, D&D, and 1st edition, all of that stuff, is that it doesn't pander to the players in terms of the lethality of the game. Your actions have serious consequences for your character. You have to think about the abilities or the attributes or the skills, whatever the system is set up around for the character in order to succeed at what you're doing. And that's just, I don't know, that's something that I've always really enjoyed. It kind of tickles my brain, and I think reinforces some of the role play aspects that I really appreciate, where it's like I actually have to think about not just the mental state and the personality of my character, but also their physical limitations as well, and their capabilities. So yeah, I mean, I love playing those games. I love running those games. At the same time, in high lethality games that I've run, like Old School Essentials or Knave or others, you know, I've seen players lose interest because their characters die too often. And, you know, that can be the way that I'm running the game. That can be the way that the mechanics of the game are set up, or it could be the way that the players are interacting with the system. I don't know. But, you know, it's something that I've seen happen multiple times now. And, yeah, I became intrigued by this idea of taking kind of like the funnel concept from like Dungeon Crawl Classics, but then just like putting it all into one character, where you can have consistency of a character, but still have change over time, as well as not just like advancement of attributes and skills and things like that, but also like a physical change to the character, or sometimes an emotional change. Some of the corruptions, not many of them, most of them are physical changes to the player character, to the supplicant, but some of them are emotional and psychic. There's one, I think that the corruption is just called Altered, and you have to re-roll your character's humor. So there's no alignment in Danse Macabre. It's going off the system of the four humors, which was still popular at that time in terms of medical history. So you can be sanguine, you can be choleric, you can be bilious, things like that. And that kind of determines like the baseline of your personality. But the text for that corruption is your personality and being have changed and it haunts you. Reroll your humor, things like that. So I don't know. I like the idea of blending the ability to hold on to one character with a high lethality game, something that has really fast, really brutal combat, that maybe makes people even shy away from getting into combat situations if they can avoid it. But then, yeah, also still kind of rewarding people for failure at the same time. Yeah.
Right, or having a change mechanic, kind of like History and Powered by the Apocalypse games, where you're not necessarily getting better, but you're like changing stuff because you're aging and gaining experience and dealing with new traumas. But here, there's that, as you said, it's physicalized, so it's kind of also the pathetic fallacy, which was very, very common in Western art up until, you know, I guess realism, right? I mean, it's sort of the inside being made visible, so that people who are, you know, more comely or whatever are also meant to be better souls, and vice versa. And in this game, everyone is slowly becoming a mutant zombie. So presumably it's kind of this leveling apocalypse effect. But yeah, the actual mechanic, right, of false death, when you die, you roll on the D6 corruption table, you gain a corruption. Yeah. How does it work over time? So let's say that happens a couple times. I get, you know, my mood goes from phlegmatic to melancholic. I get some weird, you know, I'm looking like I have a mouth on the back of one of my hands. That's awesome. You know, I get webbed digits, a bunch of eyes. Okay. What happens over time? How does it, like, and as a narrative structure, where does it tend toward, or what's the end point? Or is there one?
Well, there is an end point. So I would say that traditional concepts of mortality are not a threat for sure. However, there is the mechanic where if you gain more corruptions, so basically if you die a certain number of times that exceeds your maximum insight score, and in this game, insight is basically a combination of both your intellect and your awareness. But so, you know, if you have an insight of 5, probably pretty average score that most people would have in the game, and you die 6 times and gain 6 corruptions, you don't die. You continue living, like you said, as a mutant zombie kind of character. But the story ends. Your character has basically lost their mind. They succumb to madness. And narratively, the idea is that, you know, the corruption that's happening to you isn't just physical. It's also happening on a psychological or spiritual level. I think the way I've written is it corrupts both body and soul.
Hmm.
So at a certain point, while you can't physically die, you can lose your character after a certain number of deaths, kind of depending on your attributes at that point in the game. So yeah, mortality is not necessarily the threat, but madness and just becoming a wandering monster in the world, kind of becoming another NPC, if you will. That's the threat.
Have you played through this both ways where, as you say, you like high lethality games? Have you played through playtests where people are just corrupted out, over and over again? And have you also played through ones where you give them, because it's not clear, at least in the playtest version, the memento mori, you said, as a MacGuffin. Have you allowed certain campaigns to go in that direction where someone finds the grail, they restore the kingdom, and they either, I presume, then just get to die a true death, or become uncorrupted, or is there a good ending, or is it meant to be kind of a mirage that's always in the distance, or is that something you're still actively playtesting?
That's something I'm still actively playtesting, and I think that you can play it either way. That's something I've been kind of tossing around a bit, because what I'm actively writing right now are like guidelines for the GM, for the warden, for running the game. And it's an interesting challenge as a game that's set up for one player and one warden. I think that it has a tendency to skew more towards like a one-shot kind of setup. But at the same time, I like the idea of it kind of constantly being a mirage in the distance. One mechanic that I'm playing around with right now is the idea that at the end of any given adventure, like maybe if it's a location-based thing, like you go to a keep where somebody is rumored that there's a memento mori. At the end of it, the warden just rolls randomly to see if there is one there or not, or if it even works.
Right.
Just the kind of stuff like that. So I think those should probably be optional mechanics. And that the GM, the warden, should have the option to be like, okay, we're cutting it off here. You get the thing, it's over, whatever. Or it can be this kind of more hopeless, just continuation of the story that goes on from there. I'm not quite sure yet.
That feels very in keeping with, or earlier versions of the Dragon game, and kind of original ideas about, the table as ultimate adjudicator, as opposed to GM as ultimate adjudicator, as opposed to, I would say, in the current moment, that's also not the case. It's not like the rules learning of the 90s when you had to convince the GM that something was or wasn't the case. I think now it'd be more like, what does the table think? Best practice, I would say. So I kind of almost like this full circle of like, and it's especially as a game that's meant to be more intimate, meant to be played with two people. So that's another question I have. Can it be extended? But let's say you're playing with two people, even if you both kind of agree on where the game's heading, having some indeterminacy built in. So it's like, all right, let's roll. And if the table says there's actually a memento mori that's really a relic of the kingdom of heaven or whatever, that's going to sort of solve these problems, then it is there. And if it's not there, too bad the princess is in another castle. You can keep playing. And I think
keep trucking.
Yeah, that makes it almost, I don't want to say a strategy game, but it becomes a different vibe than the open-ended fantasy games where you are meant to figure out on your own the purpose of the game, right? And in the Dragon game, you're often taking quests because you kind of don't know. Your character has wants and desires, but it's presumed the GM's going to tell you what to do. And you're like, all right, sure, I'll do that job. You're always kind of a mercenary. And I think this game is a little different in that sense also, which I like, again, that it has a narrative structure that is more determined in advance, but actually, to your point, you're not even sure if it's resolvable. It's just, it's clear what your purpose is. It may or may not, it may just be futile. So there you go, potential players. So let me ask, have you played with more than... will. Yeah, like enter at your own risk. Have you played with more than one player, or have you only, are you pretty strict about it is meant for one GM, one player, that's it?
So far it's only been one GM, one player, which I like. Again, I like the intimacy of. However, I have been playing around with the idea of opening it up, and I think that is possible with just like a little bit of a narrative switch. It wouldn't really take a mechanical switch in any way. You could have multiple supplicants, and I think that's really the only narrative switch that would have to happen, is that it just goes from the singular to the plural in terms of that. Yeah, I mean, I would be interested to see what it looks like with multiple player characters, and I think that that's something that I'm going to seek out in playtesting as we kind of go forward in the next couple of months. With this, what's becoming really intense playtest schedule, which is exciting. But yeah, I want to play around. I want to see how it feels both ways. But like I said, so far it's just been one player, one GM. And, I don't have a good mechanical reason for that, if I'm being completely honest. The reasoning behind it was just that when I started to conceptualize the game, it felt really heavy and felt like something that should be a really intimate conversation. So I designed it towards one player, one GM for that reason. That being said, if you have a small group of people who are kind of on the same page or have the same vibe, are willing to have those conversations, then I think it would work perfectly fine, mechanically speaking.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because some of these choices are the choices, by FIA, the just designer choices that are the special sauce, the je ne sais quoi of game design, that are not ultimately up for sort of best practice debate. They're sort of like, well, I like games a certain way, or I had a feeling about this game. And some of them are philosophically motivated, and others I think are more style. So like the fact that Stillfleet, like the mechanics would work the same if you were playing it in a Mercenaries Are Fine fashion. It's Mercenaries Are Us. It's the Wagner Group, Halliburton, the game in space. It's Mothership, right? You go shoot stuff, you get paid. Whereas obviously the game enforces at every moment that you're supposed to subvert the company's the bad guy, but there's nothing mechanically to prevent you from just ignoring that, which is somewhat by design, in that, there are games that attempt to bridge the two, and I have not found them totally fulfilling. I couldn't, it's not that I couldn't think of anything. It's just like, okay, I wanted a game that the simulationism worked, and then separately I'm telling you the narrative structure. And when you're buying the game, you're buying both, and they both are, I think, they have value, but like you could just toss the narrative structure and use the simulationism. I think you have something similar here. You could play this as cool, very it does remind you of like good indie video games, I think. Which is maybe another question, but yeah, really cool game that you can play with a group like you would Dragon Game or Karen or anything else. Or you can do the one-on-one that you're recommending. And I think that's to some degree, like, how much do we know what people who play the games actually do with the games, and how much do you care?
I mean, I think that's a good point. Both of those are a good point. It's like, what control do I have over how the people that play it are going to play it, and does it really matter at the end of the day? It reminds me a lot of Iron Sworn. I don't know if you ever played that. I think it came out in like 2019. I played it in 2020, but it's an interesting structure, because using the same mechanics throughout, you can play it completely solo as kind of a journaling game if you're into that. You can play it cooperatively without a GM, but having multiple player characters, or you can play it with a GM. And the author, I think Daniel something, I'm going to screw it up. Let me look it up. What is this guy's name? I know this is not interesting content. Sean Tompkin. I just want to make sure that I'm getting people's names right. The author Sean Tompkin, he makes it very clear that like he doesn't care how you play the game. At the end of the day, the setting is the same, the mechanics are the same. You can kind of do what you want to or what you will with it. Which I think that's a good approach. I think it's a solid approach, and I think that Stillfleet does that as well. Where it's like, this is the world, this is the setting, this is your starting point, which we talked about a little bit last time. Take it from there. That's up to you. But you at least have these like very strong kind of narrative jump off points that I think really help the player characters situate themselves in the universe that you've built out.
Yeah, and that's similar. Like when I was, lauding your historical eye, it's like some of that specificity. It's similar to, I guess, the narrative structure. You could discard it, and you could say, I'm going to use these rules, but it's in a fantasy kingdom, or I'm going to use
Sure.
these rules, but it's just over in, it's, you know, the Horn of Africa.
Yeah.
It wouldn't change the rules really at all. You might not refer to things by, you know, as in Western European terms, or you might, and just, you know, you're imagining something different.
Yeah.
But like say, yeah, we don't have control over that. And for many of us, like that's not the thing we care the most about. And I think for many readers and players, it's like they're kind of going to try out whatever you give them, and not necessarily because they're loyal to you. They may not know who you are, or remember your name, but like in a way, it's like they're getting a product, right? And they want to test, you know, kick the tires a bit.
Yeah.
So I think that is also an interesting design choice of like how much, I know that was a big discussion with Stillfleet, and I imagine it'll be for the full version of Danse Macabre. How much do you give them, and how much of that you move to kind of supplemental material? So we have all kinds of other ideas, like even with the narrative structure stuff, actually, we have GM-less gaming, but it's not something we emphasized. So the core book was more traditionally like GM group of players, but we've done it, you know, by distributing the GM functions. So we included, you know, a feature on that, but really that's meant to be like a whole nother discussion. And I think that's just a choice about like, all right, well, we'll make those two different products and make sure that we test each rigorously and, you know, give them their own space. So anyway, I think that's always like part of the discussion. And I think that's something we'll come back to is like how much lore, how much direction to the GM on how to do it right, you know, and how does play testing shape that? So, you know, I just want to get on your playtest schedule and, you know, just have fun really. But also maybe that'll be, you know, another way to experience it as opposed to reading it and hearing you talk about it, is like actually be the supplicant or what have you. So
no, I do. That's the thing I think about a lot as well. Whenever I'm conceptualizing or designing stuff, it's like how much does lore matter to a player? I think that the Dragon game does teach us sometimes not that much, but other times I think that it's deeply important, and it just kind of, I think it depends on how you package it ultimately.
Yeah, the flexibility. I mean, I'm a big specificity like nut, and so this again feels so much better. Like, not to knock, like I think so. Karen, Knave, Bastards, they're all fine OSR clone type games, but the lack of specificity means I would never, like, I would just do my own. Like, I could just make up something on the spot, you know. And why would I need them in a way, you know? Whereas with your game, it's giving me something very specific and different. Which then, like I said, I think that's kind of what I was saying, is like it puts it on me to make a choice to not be in your version of France with your holy mutant zombies or whatever, right? Like I would have to like break your system in a fun way, but it's not a straitjacket because it's still it's a rules like game, and it's doing a lot of the tropes, right? It's using a lot of the rolling. You want to get a high number. There's combat, there's non-combat experiences, so it's kind of familiar, but it gives me a lot to work with and push against. Whereas I feel like games that don't give you anything, even D&D, it's true in the player's handbook it doesn't, but so many people buy at least, let's say, Forgotten Realms, or I would say if you're going to buy something by Wizards, buy Planescape stuff, right? You get a ton of ideas, right? The Planescape books are just full of good ideas for all kinds of things that could happen in a fantastic world. And so while it's true the player's handbook is like setting neutral, it sort of implies a certain setting. And then beyond that, it's like they kind of know you're going to buy. They know you like play Magic, and now it's all integrated into one mega cosmos of products or whatever. But
it's so insane.
Yeah. So anyway, that, you know, that would be like another, like, once you get this worked out, like, are you going to do Danse Macabre in space, or, you know, like what's like next? But I'll hold off on that. You may not be ready.
No, that would be sick. I might take that idea from you. No, I mean, something I have thought about doing, which I think goes back to your question earlier about the regional specificity, is looking at other places at the same time with the same kind of narrative concept happening, right? So like, this is the original game is taking place in France. What's happening across the channel? What does the island, or what did the British Isles look like at that time? What does Spain look like? What's happening in Germany, where you have, you know, these kind of like proto-Reformation politics already in the works?
Or China, right? Like
China,
if it's worldwide, what's happening in these other realms and how is it sort of culturally understood?
Yeah, I think the cultural interpretation of what's happening would be pretty fun and wildly different to explore. Because I mean, I have come at it from a very Western, Christian kind of eschatological viewpoint so far. But yeah, I mean, what would it look like in other places or anywhere in like one of the Islamic states at that time? Southern Africa, anywhere really. So yeah, the idea is to have these kind of like supplemental settings books, similar to D&D in that way, that kind of come out aside from the main rule set. That would be less mechanics, more flavor. Probably like most of the mechanics would center around NPC build out and things like that.
Right, and maybe more ventures, like here's how this Memento Mori hunt could work, and like mechanicalizing maybe, as we were talking about, like the conditions under which a certain Memento Mori exists and isn't a lie, and actually works. And like, what does it do? Does it solve the problem for everyone on Earth? It sounds like things you're still debating yourself. So you're not committing to anything on this podcast, but that would be interesting to see sort of how you approach. Excuse me.
Sorry. I got one in earlier.
How you approach those different cultural questions. So maybe that is a question to engage with, and let me know if you don't. Like, is that something you thought about in terms of setting a game in yet another kind of fantasy game in Western Europe? Is that something you've thought carefully about, I assume? And do you feel like I guess I would say this the generous version, that the way I read it is the historical specificity works really in your favor, because you're saying, it's not leaning away from what life was really like. It's like, okay, this is what life was kind of like at that time, at the turn of the, I guess the 14th into the 15th century kind of a thing. And that makes it sort of more interesting than a fantasy version of it that's sanitized. So why not just look at, the real source material? But how would you articulate? I mean, maybe that's not even the reading you intend, but.
No, I mean, that's pretty close to the reading that I intend for, I think. A part of it is that I don't like the kind of Disneyfied or Disneyfication of that period that does happen through a lot of fantasy. I think, you said earlier, in a lot of games, you have these kind of like very different religions and very different ideologies that exist more or less harmoniously. And it's just not very realistic. Not that realism has to be the point of any game. If that's not your bread and butter, that's fine. But it's something for me that I do like to think about. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of it is trying to lean into the realism around class, around access to wealth and materials, around just the kind of quality of life back then. Because, again, the player character, most of the NPCs that you're going to encounter are poor people. They're not lords and things like that. That's something that I like having as a backdrop, narratively, historically, whatever, but not necessarily something that I want to have players enact or to really engage in. I think that the more interesting stories happen for people that are kind of disenfranchised from the get-go. And also, as a leftist, as an anti-capitalist, like, I don't really want to make princes and dukes and kings look like good guys in the story. Nor do I want the papacy or, like anybody in those kind of traditional roles of power to look like the good guys in the story. And I think that the disparity between the average life of a villein or a peasant and the life of the Pope or a king or a duke or anybody in a higher position of power, that tension is, I think, inherently interesting. And I think just on a more kind of visible surface level, when you're looking at that time in history, there's just this very obvious disconnect between those two different classes in terms of worldview, in terms of access to goods and materials and wealth, all of that, all that kind of stuff. So that's a lot of what I wanted to lean into with the setting. Yeah, I don't know. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure. I might be rambling.
No, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I was just curious. In the same, one of the inspirations for Stillfleet was, okay, well, what if at some point in the history of capitalism, you fought back in a more concerted fashion, and how would that come? What are the labor politics like that make that possible?
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, not wanting to do a game necessarily about like, okay, literal chattel slavery and rebellions in that context, and trying to set it kind of closer to the lived experience of many players, where it's like, all right, well, maybe you have a job and you just don't like your job, and you think your bosses are kind of jerks, but they themselves would say, well, I'm just doing my job and there's bosses above me, and so on. So it's sort of, where do you pick your battle and how do you frame it, in order to surface class tensions and make those fun game things that are apparent. So I think it's interesting that you're working with kind of the Graal, cycle material, right? It's epic medieval combat, but also you're not as focused as those stories tend to be on princesses and whatnot, right? You're like, everyone is kind of normcore. It's very unlikely you ever meet anyone who's not a farmer, or like basically a knight who is robbing you.
Right. Yeah, most of the knights that you would meet in Danse Macabre are either now brigands or chevauché knights from England who just stayed to continue pillaging after wartime. Basically, they're not the heroes of the story.
Yeah, and I think the leveling effect of everyone is becoming a mutant zombie. That's another aspect you've introduced that changes the class dynamics. It maybe doesn't get rid of them, but it's going to have that leveling effect, which I would say, for example, in a lot of games I've thought about and worked on, climate disruption plays that role. It's the apocalypse that is, it's not going to fix things, but it's going to change them a lot, and it's going to change them for everyone, and you can't really escape it, even if obviously people who are starting off with more privilege are going to be able to weather out the proverbial storms in more comfort. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be comfortable. So right. I think there is something interesting there that you can lean into. And yeah, I hadn't ever thought when I was reading this about you'd write a book about another area of the world undergoing the same change. But I now I'm like really curious, what your thoughts are. So
I don't even know what that would look like yet. I think a part of it is that my area, it's not expertise, my area of interest in history has been kind of centered around this place and time. You can thank Barbara Tuchman and her book A Distant Mirror for that, which is just like for anybody who might be listening or might listen in the future, that's a fantastic book. It's really interesting. She does spend a lot of time with the aristocracy and talking about the kind of like higher levels of politicking that were happening at the time, but it is a fantastic analysis of the intersection between class, religion, politics, warfare. It's great. And it's almost exclusively about 14th century France and the changes that came about because of the plague, because of the pestilence. It's fantastic. But yeah, so I don't know what other places would look like at this point. It's really just an idea that I've been kicking around.
Yeah. No, I mean, like if this was like a year from now, right? Like maybe that's like, it just hadn't even occurred to me like, oh, that's a very natural place you could take this game, right?
Yeah.
So I love that.
Nice.
All right. Well, it's probably coming up on time. Chris, what are some other things? Did you want to talk about other aspects of the game? So I asked you the questions that popped in my mind reading the content, but
let's see, what are some other things to bring up? I mean, really, I guess, right now, like I said earlier, it's a work in progress. There's still a lot to be expanded on. Building out lore, building out kind of the NPC mechanics a little bit more, some guidelines for running the game, things like that. But no, I mean, other than that, that's pretty much where we're at with it.
Cool. Well, how can folks, first of all, pick up the playtest version, which is really great, and I really recommend everyone do. And then how should they connect with you once they read it and they're like, that's cool, I really want to play this, and or I want to talk to you about it, and or I have ideas?
Yeah, you can get the playtest version on itch through my itch page, which I believe is timespaceplace.itch.io/Danse Macabre. And I'll drop a link. We'll drop a link in the show notes to that.
Right.
But then, yeah, otherwise you can find me online on Instagram. I am Pickett, Pickett _tattoos. And on Twitter, I am Pickett Tweets. Again, we'll drop links for that. I don't really feel like spelling out all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, for anybody that wants to play test it, you can drop me a DM on Instagram or on Twitter. I'm also on Discord. We'll drop a link for that. Looking at DMs on there as well. But yeah, pretty much any way you can get in contact. I mean, you can also comment and follow me on itch as well. That's probably the easiest way to kind of centralize everything. So yeah.
So time, space, place, which is
time, space, place.
Time, space, place. Awesome. We'll have to talk more about the anthropological idea of place and placement,
Yes.
cultural place versus space, and sort of physical space and non-places.
Oh yeah, I love
like
it.
Airports and malls. So that's something actually we referenced in Stillfleet at some point. Marc Roger's work.
Oh really?
Speaking of France, a few hundred years later. Well, this is great. Chris, do you want to end here, or do you want to say anything else? Do you want to talk about anything else in episode 2?
No, yeah, let's wrap it here. We'll come back with new ideas for next episode.
Cool. So Why We Roll right now is just a thing we're doing on streaming, but we're going to start dropping these chats in ye old podcast feed.
Yeah.
And we can be found at places at Why We Roll Pod. So thanks for watching or listening, ye people of the present and future. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Wythe. And
right.
Yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. Talk to you soon.
Beep, beep, beep.